Hello again, and welcome to the Temple Institute Parsha class with Gedalia Meyer. We hope everyone has survived the turmoil of the past few months and is looking forward to the challenge of rebuilding a fragmented world with fragmented societies. Israel is almost back in full swing, but still not quite there. The situation in America is not as hopeful, but America has weathered worse than this, and it's still come out strong. This week's Parsha in Israel is called Beha'alotcha, a daunting-looking word that means something on the order of when you raise up. This rather biblical-sounding phrase refers to the procedure of lighting the candelabra in the tabernacle. Specifically, it is talking about lighting the famous seven-branched menorah that was located towards the entrance of the tabernacle and provided most of the light in the otherwise dark innards of the structure. Lighting the menorah was an essential task that had to be done daily. It was not simply flipping on a switch. This parsha contains a great many different subjects, many of which have seemingly nothing to do with what comes before or after. In fact, this parsha is almost like a microcosm of the entire journey through the wilderness. It has many details about service in the tabernacle, a second chance version of the Passover offering for those who missed the first one, a good deal on how the various stages of the journeys were initiated and concluded, and the classic biblical complaints over the difficulties encountered along the way. It concludes with an odd story of Miriam, the sister of Moshe, getting struck with the temporary version of the dreaded skin disease that we first saw in the middle of the book of Leviticus. All in all, it is a tour de force of biblical imagery and drama. In the middle of all this are two slightly strange verses that don't seem to belong where they are. In fact, they really don't seem to belong anywhere in the Torah. They strike anyone who reads them as very poetic and certainly seem to be indicative of something profound, but it is not easy to detect what that is. They stand by themselves in the midst of regular narrative. These two verses are famous, at least among Jews, for two things. First is their actual content. The translation of the verse is generally along the lines of, quote, "And when the ark went forth, Moshe said, 'Arise, Hashem, and scatter your enemies, and let those who hate you flee from before you.' And when it rested, he said, 'Return, Hashem, to the myriads and thousands of Israel.'" These verses are recited in synagogues when the Torah is taken out of a special enclosure located at the focal point of the building, and when it is returned. This enclosure is traditionally called the Aron Kodesh, or Holy Ark, in commemoration of the original Ark of the Covenant to which these verses relate. They have been sung or chanted to 1,000 different tunes and are among the most treasured pieces of Hebrew poetry. Judaism would not be Judaism without them. But there is another reason why these verses are famous, which is not as well known, even among Jews. These verses are surrounded by something quite unique in the Torah. In fact, it may be something unique in the entire corpus of world literature. This feature is easy to miss if one is not looking for it. Even if one spots it, it can easily be dismissed as some strange biblical version of a typo. Immediately preceding the first verse, in every Torah scroll in the world, is found a letter that simply does not belong. It is the Hebrew letter nun, which denotes the N sound. But this is not just any old nun. It is written backwards and upside down. The same backwards, upside down letter occurs immediately after the end of the second verse. Both before and after these strange letters, there are regular narratives that give no indication whatsoever as to why they are there. The truth is, nobody really knows why these letters are there and when they were first inserted into the Torah scroll. But everyone agrees that they have to be there, so they are a universal, if unusual, feature of the Torah. In fact, if a Torah scroll was written without them, it would be considered a major aberration from tradition that would most likely require correction. So what are these letters doing there, and why are they written the way they are? In all likelihood, they represent a biblical version of an asterisk, indicating that something strange is afoot. There is a long-standing rabbinic tradition that gives justification for these letters. It claims, rather surprisingly, that they delineate these two verses as a separate book of the Torah, inserted right smack in the middle of the otherwise complete book of Numbers. In other words, according to this tradition, there are actually 7 books of the Torah. The normal first 3, Numbers before these verses, Numbers after these verses, and Deuteronomy. As bizarre as that may sound, it is solidly based in rabbinic lore and considered to be the Jewish equivalent of gospel truth. Just to be clear, Judaism still believes that the 5 books of Moses are the 5 books of Moses, or Chumash, which means something on the order of divided by 5. This strange tradition hasn't altered that unassailable fact in any way. It is just that there is this little asterisk that must be attached to that fact that serves as a kind of footnote. Nobody really thinks that there are 7 books in the Torah, but they do insist that these verses were meant to stand alone in some way, distinct from the rest of the Torah. Why this is so is anybody's guess. There are many explanations that have been offered by Bible commentators over the centuries, but none of them really hit the spot in explaining this anomaly. What is probably the most straightforward explanation is what we have already said, that these letters do separate these verses from what comes before and after and sets them apart. Apparently, they were not really part of the narrative at all, even though they do fit in more or less. They serve as a kind of poetic description of the Ark of the Covenant and what it meant to the Israelites. It is difficult to really encapsulate the significance of the Ark in the Bible. There's no question that it is the most famous and most important thing in the entire text. The instructions for building it were given towards the end of Exodus, when it was first constructed. It was a relatively simple cabinet, about 3 feet by 2 feet by 2 feet. It was made of wood that was plated with gold on both the inside and the outside. It was covered by a rather elaborate top piece made of gold that included a carving of angels hovering about in some way. It contained the 2 sets of tablets, one broken and one whole, that Moshe brought down from Mount Sinai, upon which were written the 10 Commandments. It also housed the Torah scroll and various other relics of the biblical journey through the wilderness. It was placed at the back of the tabernacle in a highly protected rear chamber that could only be entered by select people at select times. It played a similar role in the first temple in Jerusalem. It was lost upon the destruction of that temple. These verses attempt to describe the inspirational and perhaps otherworldly feeling that accompanied the ark during the journeys through the wilderness. Arise, God, and scatter your enemies. Return, God, to the myriads and thousands of Israel. What do these words convey? It is not infrequent that when one is singing or chanting these words in the synagogue to beautiful tunes, one forgets what the words actually mean. It is a bit unsettling to sing a beautiful tune about scattering one's enemies. For that matter, it really isn't clear what it means for God to return to the myriads and thousands of Israel. Where has God been this whole time that calls for returning? Perhaps there is some explanation for these puzzling but inspiring words. The hard fact is that Jewish belief, as any belief, has opposition. For better or worse, the Israelites and the Jews have experienced no shortage of enemies. In fact, for many centuries, it was almost a calling card to respected society to be the lethal enemy of the Jews. Even in our enlightened modern times, anti-Semitism never goes on a break for more than a short time. The Jewish belief in God included the idea that their God was on their side and that their enemies were God's enemies. This almost goes without saying in any religious culture. It was a primary requirement of any culture's deity to protect the faithful from harm, including from human enemies. While this notion may have lost some of its relevance and power in modern times, there is no question that it is still out there in many societies. This is precisely the sentiment that is expressed in that first verse. God should arise and scatter those enemies because that is the divine help that we need. We need the space and the wherewithal to practice our faith and our beliefs without opposition or risk of harm. This is what we ask of our God. The Ark of the Covenant, more than anything else, represented that sense of divine protection. And so it is the symbol of that feeling. The second verse about returning is not as easy to pin down. Where is God returning from? Why isn't God always around? A hard fact of spiritual reality, assuming there is such a thing, is that we frequently get the feeling that God is anywhere but around. It is all too often that the unsettling perception is that God simply isn't there in our lives, no matter how hard we try to detect God's presence. This seems to be the rule rather than the exception of the way things are. It is to this feeling that this verse speaks. Return, God, to the myriads and thousands of Israel. Where have you been? Why aren't you here with us where we need you? The answer to these questions is existential. This is our situation. It is largely our own doing in driving God's presence from our lives. There are so many obstacles to gaining a sense that God's presence is indeed there that it frequently seems like chasing a rainbow or trying to hear the sound of one hand clapping. For better or worse, this is our spiritual existence, and we must make an effort to rise to the challenge of finding God. There is probably nothing in life that is as difficult as this challenge. But by the same token, there is probably nothing that is more accessible, more right within our grasp. It is simply a matter of reaching out and grasping. This is what this verse expresses: the innate desire for God to return to us and to once again become part of our lives. When the ark rested, perhaps, the ancient Israelites gained this feeling. We no longer have an ark, but we do have this verse and still have access to the feeling it was meant to convey. What are we waiting for? Shabbat Shalom.